So good afternoon. I know that you can't see me at Fort Silicon, but you won't be able to both see and hear me at the same time. I'm Michelle Johnson, Chancellor, and I want to do a quick introduction to today, and then I'll be introducing our consultant. So one of the things that started all of this is that Pierce College's mission is to create quality educational opportunities for our diverse community of learners to thrive in an evolving world. And to do that, to fulfill our mission, equity became an important issue for us. As we worked on achieving the dream over the last 4 years, a core element that we saw as we reviewed data was that our students were not equally succeeding. That as we disaggregated our data and we looked at different groups of students by age and ethnicity, gender, background, levels of economic status, all of those pieces, we could see that we weren't getting the same results. So we set a goal to close the achievement gap for all students by 2020. We also wanted to make sure that students continue to achieve. So it wasn't like holding students back and let others catch up. It was moving all students up and then closing the gaps at the same time. As part of one of those groups, there was an equity team that came together that were faculty and staff, and they began to explore issues around equity. We also had a group around poverty, and we had a community of practice going on, as well as other places across the college where we were really trying to pay attention to the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. There was a proposal during the budget processes a year ago. There were a number of items coming forward about how to deal with these issues. And one of them was to hire an individual to kind of lead the efforts in the district. We wanted to know whether that was really a right decision and what else we needed to do. And so we set aside some money in last year's budget process to be able to deal with this issue as we moved forward. We didn't want to not have the resources we needed once we decided what it is we needed to do. And so we sent out a request for proposal to hire a consultant to come in and to help us explore our climate, our culture, our policies, our procedures, our planning, our publications, kind of all of the aspects of Pierce College around the areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we had the opportunity, Tanya Bowers, who was with us today, many of you have met her. She's been introduced to us before, so I'm not going to go through all of her bio. She's going to tell you all the steps she took, so we did hire her to come in and to conduct this organizational review. And so she's here today to share with all of you the results of her work. We are handed out index cards because unfortunately, the reason I'm standing up here close to the computer is so that we can hear. And so rather than having you ask questions during her presentation, if you would write down questions that you have as you go through it. If you want to introduce, say who you are, identify yourself on the card, that's fine, because we can always follow up with you. If you choose not to, that's all right as well. And then after Tanya finishes, we'll be able to address some of those questions and then open it up for questions and answers as well. And we'll still have to probably use a card process, or at least come close to the computer, one of us, to go ahead and relay both here at Puyallup and at Fort Silicon. So with that, and Matt Wusher is recording this for other people who can't be here today. And so please join me in welcoming Tanya Bowers, our consultant, to share with us her results. So Tanya, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Can I get a thumbs up if you can? Okay, great. I can see that. That's terrific. Jim Butler advised me just to speak in my normal conversational voice, so I'm not going to scream. And unless I see arms waving from you all, I will go ahead and proceed in the fashion that Chancellor Johnson spoke about. So it's really wonderful to be here. I think a lot of you know I actually live on the east side of the state in the Tri-Cities, Washington Tri-Cities. So I am with you virtually. And I just have to say this has been a really long road since we started, because Pierce is such a thorough college. I think we've had a really, really valuable process, and it's been very powerful. I wanted to thank Chancellor Johnson, Presidents Yoakum and Cavalluzzi, as well as the rest of you who gave your all, who answered questions, who showed up for various sessions that were held, so that this process could be as informed as possible. So we are now going to launch into my final report of findings, and voila. So with that, let's get started. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what the next hour and 15 minutes will be like. I'm sharing with you what my scope of work was at the outset. I'm going to talk a little bit about the path that I set forth for us to assess, analyze, plan, and report about the things Chancellor Johnson spoke earlier. I'll go through what my data collection process was like and some of the major takeaways that I came up with as I listened to you all. And then we're going to go over some of the deliverables, things that I actually had to turn in to the executive team. These are things which included a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I put together an equity, diversity, and inclusion plan. And one of the things I was also asked to report on was the, I would say, the feasibility, or to advise as to whether we should move forward with an executive level leadership position around equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm going to also talk about that process. And lastly, we will go to those questions that you all are going to have on those cards that Chancellor Johnson spoke about, and then I'll be able to answer. So just to begin, once again, the scope of work that was set forward for me when I responded to the RFP was to do an assessment of the district's current state, capacity, and capability around cultural competency, as well as diversity and inclusion. And one thing you might notice in that first bullet there is that we talk about diversity and inclusion rather than equity. And I think at the beginning we weren't entirely clear what the relationship was going to be, even though we knew that a lot of work had taken place around equity. And you'll see as I get to the recommendations, we really talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next, I'm going to be talking about this analysis of the district's diversity. So again, looking at the entire college district, that goes into this SWOT analysis. And then I was to prepare this equity, diversity, and inclusion plan. Once again, going through this job description and work plan, which is something that I did actually go ahead and propose, seeming like that was the appropriate course of action, having assessed and analyzed all the data that you provided. And recently, I prepared a final report of all findings for the executive team. Once again, just looking at this path that we took. So as I attempted to assess the district's diversity, I tried to establish a baseline, and President Yoakum worked with me, and we put together I worked with a number of of employees within the district, but President Yokin was my main contact. And we put together the survey. You may remember the diversity inclusion survey that went out at the end of last year. And then I did a bunch of research to gather more background information so I could have a fuller picture of what has actually taken place at Pierce in the Pierce district. We did interviews with select individuals. Those allowed me to go slightly more in depth. Then we did focus groups, and I believe all of you saw notice of these focus groups that were held with students and also with employees. Then we conducted a number of visioning exercises or world cafes. We did 2 of these with students, and then one larger visioning exercise we did during the all-district day with employees. So I'm going to now take you through the inquiry process and share with you what was asked and then what some of my takeaways were. So as I mentioned, even though we started with the climate surveys, I didn't actually receive the results of those until later. So the first bit of information I took in was through these interviews. And you will see on the screen, we did 14 of those with employees, and then we did 2 with students. And when I arrived on campus, that was the very end of November after the Thanksgiving holiday, and through the beginning of December rather. And even though the interviews were with different populations, I asked the same questions. And you'll see on the left side of the screen, one of the questions that I posed to everyone was how they would define diversity and inclusion at Pierce. And you see in that Wordle, that picture that we have below there, those are some of the words that I got back when I asked people to define diversity, specifically diversity and inclusion at Pierce. And then on the right side of the screen, you see something different. I asked everyone to rate diversity and inclusion at Pierce. I asked them on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not well or poorly, and 5 being extremely well, what they thought the environment for diversity and inclusion was at Pierce. And then after that, I asked folks to rate how well integrated they thought diversity and inclusion was into the culture at Pierce. So those are 2 slightly different questions, one having to do more with the campus environment, and the other talking about cultural integration, the integration of diversity and inclusion into the culture at Pierce. And then below where the question is, you actually see what the categorization was. And people, I would say Pierce did, in terms of the rating, folks thought the environment for diversity and inclusion was more than favorable. If you take 3 being right in the middle, you see it's actually 3.8. That was the average that we came up with. And then in terms of integration of diversity and inclusion into the culture at Pierce, it was slightly lower, but a little bit more than the median, which would have been 3. It would have been 3 because 1 was the lowest and 5 was the highest. So at 2.39. And now I'm going to actually tell you what some of the data were that I got back when I was asking about diversity and inclusion here at Pierce. I learned that folks felt there was great diversity in the student body at Pierce. There had been a long history of dealing with diversity and inclusion at Pierce as well. Simultaneously, there were scars. There were scars in the process of dealing with difference and similarities, but there was definitely an acknowledgement that of late there had been a change in the tide. And there was also great hope that this change would be sustained rather than it just be window dressing. Some of the things that people found encouraging was that there had been more of a recent focus on poverty and equity. Chancellor Johnson just reminded you all of that in terms of the path leading to my consulting with Pierce. At the same time, a lot of folks questioned why there was such a comfort or embrace of talking about poverty, and why they felt it hadn't been the same in terms of talking about race and racism. I also heard both sides in terms of there being a desire for more conversations around this subject matter. And then there was also some ambivalence. Those who felt like, okay, we've talked about this enough. And or those who felt like we've talked about it, and now what? One of the other things that I heard was that there was great power concentrated in administration. Some felt that there wished for more sharing of that power. I also heard in terms of concerns that there was a lack of employees of color at Pierce, particularly in faculty and administration. It was also called out that some departments had greater diversity, particularly racial ethnic diversity. And then folks also spoke about things like gender within particular divisions, departments, or employment levels. So given this lack that was acknowledged, there was also a call for not only more recruitment, but also diverse talent retention, helping to ensure that employees ended up staying, and also for development. One of the things that was acknowledged with great enthusiasm was praise for the faculty staff of Color Conference, FSOCC. And even though that's something I believe Pierce had been sending folks to for several years, in the last couple of years there's just been a greater commitment, not only for people of color, but for folks in general who wanted to be supportive of faculty and staff of color. Additionally, there was a call for a greater diversity and inclusion presence. So the next thing that I heard back in terms of our inquiry was the climate survey. And even though the survey had been opened the 2nd of December, and it was closed December 18th, as I mentioned, I didn't actually get the data. I didn't actually hear some of the results of the surveys until the 29th of December. And you'll actually see up there, again, we had the survey open to students and open to employees. And even though you see how many folks the survey was put out to, you also see the number of respondents in that third column. The response rate indicates the percentage based on the number of respondents divided by the larger population. So with about 13% for students and 39% employees, it was felt in the IR department that this had been relatively successful in terms of the surveys that had gone out, even though this was the first one focusing on diversity inclusion. And you also see we have a margin of error as well. This is really a confidence measure, and normally we see about a 95% average. And basically what that means is that for one out of every 20 respondents, that will be, only that one person will be more than what the average is. So now I'm going to actually take you through what some of the results were. And all the questions we asked them of both the student and the employee population. These next 6 questions that I'm going to go through speak about perceptions of insensitive remarks or discrimination. The first 3 slides I'm going to talk about student perception, so how students responded. And after that, I'll talk about employees' responses. So I thought this was really interesting that students, the first categories that you see them talking about were women, that they heard insensitive remarks on or witnessed discrimination on the part of other students, their peers, and they saw it being relevant or about women. I've listed the top 3 categories for each of these questions. So women came up, and you'll see their numbers on top of each of the charts. So for the top 3 answers, it ranged from 1.69 to 1.62. Those were the highest ranking ones in students' perception of other students. And before I actually talk about what those numbers mean, I just want to remind you that for these questions, once again, we asked people to rank these in terms from 5 to 1. 5 being frequently, that they have witnessed or heard insensitive remarks or discrimination. Frequently would be 10 or more times a year. A 4 was often, 6 to 9 times a year. 3 was occasionally, 3 to 5 times a year. 2 meant rarely, 1 or more times a year, and 1 was never. So even though these are the top 3 ranking responses that you see in front of you, you'll actually see with a 1, that means that it was somewhere between a 2 and a 1, right? 2 being 1 or more times a year, 1 or 2 times a year, and a 1 being never. So the thing that I thought was really interesting as we go through the next few slides, and the next slide are student perceptions of what they have seen on the part of faculty in terms of insensitive remarks and discrimination. And you'll see once again women ranked at the top. Then we have non-native English speakers, and SES refers to socioeconomic status. And you'll see those numbers are a little bit lower than they were for what students perceived their peers, other students, making. And then this third slide reports on students' perceptions of these insensitive remarks or discrimination on the part of staff or administrators. So they noticed these remarks being made about women, females, most frequently. And you'll see the numbers are even lower than they were for students reporting on other students. But here, you'll notice it comes in the highest for women, and then religious backgrounds. And I generally shared the top 3 answers, but you'll see the third ranking answers were the same for socioeconomic status, disability, or racial and ethnic backgrounds. Now I'm going to switch to employees' perceptions. And for employees, you'll notice for employees' perceptions about students making insensitive remarks, faculty making insensitive remarks, and staff or administrators, you'll actually see that their top answer was the same. So they noticed that most of the remarks were about non-native English speakers. Women was second, socioeconomic status was third. And then you'll find for employees talking about faculty, again, non-native English speakers, women and particular religious backgrounds being next. And you'll see those numbers. I'm just going back to the slide before us. So you'll notice from students, employees' perceptions of students to employees' perceptions of faculty, they're a little bit lower for faculty than they were for students. And when we go to employee perceptions of staff or administrators, the numbers are somewhat similar, with 1.55 being the highest. For non-native English speakers, that's what they rank the highest. So again, interesting just how students noticed that it was about women. That's what most of the bias came up around. And then when employees were remarking on perceptions of insensitivity or discrimination, it being towards non-native English speakers, which is what came up the highest for them. In one of the next questions that we asked was about having faced discrimination or harassment yourselves. And the next slide actually shows both students and employees together. I was able to do this, and both students and employees for the top answers had the same 4 categories, although the ranking was slightly different. You'll see the categories: age, gender, religion, race, and ethnicity were the same, except that for students, they felt that the discrimination was the greatest on the basis of age, whereas employees felt that the greatest discrimination they had faced or harassment was on the basis of gender. And then religion and or race, ethnicity, those flip for 3rd and 4th place. But once again, just to remember, with the numbers being between 2 and 1, that's between rarely, which is once or twice a year, and never. The next question is about facing feelings about diversity on campus. And we had, one of the things that you'll notice here is that we had the same answers come up for both students and employees. And this was, again, on a scale of 5 to 1, from frequently to never. Both employees and students remarked that they felt awkward around those who were different than themselves. For employees, that was slightly higher than it was for students. But in 2nd place, feeling a need to hide my own identity or views. For students, it was a little bit higher than it was reported for employees. And then lastly, the feeling that I need to represent my own identity or my own views in the classroom or in the workplace. Both groups ranked feeling that need thirdly in terms of their experiences about diversity or their feelings about diversity on campus. The next slide, participants were asked to rate a number of sentences in terms of diversity on campus. And I was able to capture both students and employees on this slide, but you'll notice that their top ranking answers were different. There was one common factor you'll see in there. So students, very interestingly, they felt that in this order, administration, then faculty, and staff were respectful of all different cultures, people of all different backgrounds or identities. Whereas employees felt most strongly that there were opportunities at Pierce to learn from other cultures. They secondly ranked feeling a sense of belonging. And then thirdly, they felt that faculty were respectful of all. So that just shows you some of the range of responses. And next we're going to switch to a question. Folks were asked how they felt Pierce was responsive in response to different questions about diversity and inclusion. So you'll see how students and employees responded. Students, interestingly, felt that Pierce adequately addresses race or racism. Next was listed disability or ableism, and then you'll see gender and sexism. Interestingly enough, employees felt slightly differently. They agreed that there was a big focus on disability ableism. They felt sexual orientation or homophobia, that ranked secondly, and they also agreed that gender and sexism received focus. That was ranked thirdly for both groups. I just want to note that the ranking here is slightly different with the weighted average, which is more or less the median. Here, folks were asked to answer, once again, between a 5, strongly agree, and a 1, which is strongly disagree. And you'll note that the answers that ranked highest were between 4 and 3, actually between 4 and 3.5. So that would bring us somewhere between agree and neutral. Next, we asked folks to talk about their likelihood in terms of some behaviors they might exhibit on, I would say on campus, but on the various campuses within the district. And here you'll see that our scale was slightly different. We had 4 being very likely and 1 being somewhat unlikely. So rather than a 5, it was between a 4 and a 1. And for both employees and students, you'll see that the answers were ranked fairly high, between a 4 and I would say a 3.25. And you'll see actually that the top 2 answers flipped for the students and employees between getting to know individuals. Both felt that you do a great deal of this, but the employees actually felt that they do more of not repeating derogatory comments or jokes, which is what came in second. Interestingly, employees rated both of those higher than students had actually reported that, those same answers, even though they were flipped. And both populations talked about not forwarding emails with derogatory comments or jokes. Next category talks about frequency of the following, and here we went back in terms of this scale: 5 being frequently, 10 or more times a year, 1 being never. And you'll notice even though the following categories ranked highly, they were still not much larger than a 2, which means rarely or once or twice a year. So students insensitive remarks, that ranked the highest for both students and employees, but you'll notice that the students thought witnessing discrimination was second highest, whereas employees thought that third. Students noted faculty's insensitive remarks as second. They ranked that second, whereas employees noted staff's insensitive remarks as coming in second. This is one of the last questions we're going to focus on. Of course, I'm not taking you through every single response that we got in the surveys. I just cherry-picked the ones that I thought would be more telling. But in looking at improvement on diversity and inclusion efforts at Pierce, students ranked student organizations, diversity and inclusion events, and lastly, faculty recruitment as highest in terms of what they thought could make a difference. And those came in between 2.5. Actually, they're all a little bit over 2.5, would be somewhere between disagree and neutral. Whereas employees felt that student retention, faculty recruitment, and faculty retention would be the things that would make the biggest difference. And for them, in terms of their agreement or disagreement with this, those ranked between neutral and agreeing. I thought it would also be important for us to go slightly deeper. Some of the questions, you may recall, participants were asked to identify themselves. And one of the areas folks were encouraged to identify themselves according to was their racial ethnic background. Some of you marked that you considered yourself to be a student or an employee of color, a person of color. And so we asked some questions regarding your sentiment about being at Pierce. And you'll note that 165 of you answered as students, whereas 66 of you answered these questions as employees. And for both categories, what came in the highest, again, this was a yes or no, so 1 being yes and a 0 being no. Receiving adequate support on campus, that came in for as over 50%. For students, for employees, it was slightly higher. The next category that ranked was the assumption that you are here because of your race or ethnicity. 25% of these employees of color indicated their sentiment about that, whereas only 5%. There was 5% agreement about that in terms of students. And for the next two areas, being victim of a hate crime or fearing for physical safety, all those were the third and fourth highest ranking questions. You'll see that it was a much lower percentage of folks who reported that. So you may recall for the survey that there was a combination of being asked to indicate rank things on a scale, and then there were other questions for which folks were encouraged to answer specifically with qualitative data rather than quantitative data. So these were some of the things that were light bulbs came up for me as I read through what some of those data were. So I heard something that I hadn't heard quite as much of during the interviews, that Christians and conservatives feel slighted on campus. There was also a lot of talk about the impact of faculty biases, the biases that faculty have in the district. One of the things that I saw was that people feel they've experienced prejudice on just about every single basis. There are, not only is there diversity, but diversity, there are many manifestations of diversity. And with every single manifestation from appearance, physical body type, wearing makeup, to things that we think of more commonly, racial, ethnic background, things that have become more relevant more recently, gender identity, to people's political affiliation, folks' abilities or disabilities. So I would say that the sentiment of having experienced prejudice really ran the gamut through all those different identities. There was a desire for more clubs, more student clubs, as well as events on the basis of different identities and diversity and inclusion. It was really obvious as I read through all the comments that diversity is being interpreted in many different ways. There was shared sentiment that Pierce is a great place. A lot of times when organizations engage in the types of querying processes, which Pierce is now doing, oftentimes those who are being talked to think, oh, this is happening because something egregious has happened. And one of the things that came up was that, for the most part, there was a lot of positivity. And I did also read a lot of sentiments that enough is being done around diversity, particularly around race. Mind you, for all these things that I'm reporting, there were comments to the opposite. But I am attempting to share with you what the breadth was of the things that I heard, and where I heard a lot of agreement. So next, what I'm going to do is take you into our next category, which were focus groups. So if you remember, invitations went out to, I believe, everyone on campus, and then folks were encouraged to self-select. So we had, in the end, 20 focus groups took place. 9 of them were with students, 11 were with employees. We engaged in these at the beginning of the calendar year, at the end of January to the beginning of February. And again, I asked a question that was slightly different than what I had asked during the interviews. I asked participants to describe diversity and inclusion at Pierce within the college district in one word. And then you'll see in that Wordle picture that I have there a number of the words that I got back, a number of the descriptors. I asked for one-word descriptors. So you see those. And then the next thing that I asked for the attendees of the focus groups to do was to add a positive, a negative, or a neutral value to that word. Because as we all know, word can mean different things to different people. But my hope was that in asking them to qualify that word, that I would be able to figure out where they were coming from. And you'll note that we had 22 students, 56 employees who participated. But for the most part, those who felt that diversity inclusion at Pierce was positive, those ranked a little higher. You'll see we had 35 responses to that effect. Less for those who thought it was neutral, and even fewer who felt their descriptor was negative. What I did next, you'll see on the left side of the screen, what the next set of questions that I asked everyone to respond to were. When people were asked to think about diversity and inclusion at Pierce, I asked folks to list what factors contributed to diversity and inclusion at Pierce. I also asked folks to talk about what things took away from diversity and inclusion at Pierce. We asked attendees then to place those factors that they listed previously, particularly for those that diminished from diversity and inclusion, to put those into themes or categories. And from those themes or categories, I asked folks to rank in order of importance, things that they thought could end up leading to more inclusion or more change, or moving diversity and inclusion forward at Pierce on a scale of 1 to 5. And you'll see on the right side of the screen how those recommendations ranked. Now, keep in mind, I did not have a list of categories ahead of time, so each group was slightly different, not only in terms of the identities that they had. We have everything from interdisciplinary groups, employees. We had a focus group around that. Some were around gender. Others were around people of color. Others were around those with disabilities. We also had, what were the other ones around? We had military as well. And based on the nature of the individual focus group, there tended to be a different focus, you might say. And sometimes there was a lot of overlap. So what I've done here on the right-hand side of the screen was, to the best of my ability, I actually attempted to chunk those recommendations that they had, placing them into categories. So the thing that came up most of all in terms of recommendations were talking about prejudices and biases, or a lack of cultural competency. The area that came in second was around employees of color, their lack of presence, and things that were associated with that: hiring, recruitment, retention, promotion. Third most we saw was the category of disabilities, abilities, accommodations, and access. For the fourth and fifth rankings, you'll actually see a number of bullets listed there, and that isn't because the bullets following the number. It's not that those categories fall under that. It's just that there were about for number 4, there were 4 different areas that ranked fourth. District or college issues, things that pertained to Pierce. Low socioeconomic status, poverty, affordability. Administration, leadership, issues dealing with administration or leadership. And lastly, access to opportunities. And then ranking fifth most highest were things, I had 5 different things that came in there. Folks remarked about the lack of training, knowledge of resources, although it was acknowledged that there are a lot of resources, people didn't have enough information about what they were or how to find them. Physical space and location. Again, looking at all the different locations where Pierce is, and some of the challenges of having a decentralized district. Communication, feeling that there wasn't enough of it or it wasn't being done in the right way. And lastly, visibility and recognition. This really had to do with different affinity groups or different types of diversity feeling that they needed more visibility or more recognition. So that was the list of recommendations. And then the last thing that I asked participants to do, given those particular recommendations they came up with, was I wanted them to recommend some different actions that would actually help to move Pierce forward in terms of inclusion, helping Pierce be more inclusive of its diversity. And folks listed things from programs, policies, classes, curriculums, and actions. So now I'm going to go to what some of the takeaways were from the focus groups. And before I begin, I just want to say and acknowledge that what came out of this really was, I don't want to say everything under the sun, but there was just a huge number of topics that were listed, some of which have traditionally fallen under the scope of diversity and inclusion and equity, others which had maybe didn't have as much to do with those areas or haven't traditionally been considered a part of diversity and inclusion. I have done my best to try and include everything that was mentioned, but when I actually move forward to some of the recommendations in the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Plan, I have stuck more closely to those areas that have typically fallen under categories associated with diversity and inclusion work. So the first thing that I would say struck me from the focus groups were the issue of silos. And silos take place in every which way in terms of, this is something we heard from employees mostly, but it impacted things like the need for information, training, inclusion, professional development, and different opportunities. Another issue that came up was the cost of education at Pierce, specifically for low socioeconomic status. And that was for students, but it was remarked that things were expensive in general at Pierce. We also heard a lot about scheduling and advising of classes. I heard a great deal about college success, critiques of it, recommendations for how it could be more successful or function differently. There was great praise as well as criticism of Pierce's faculty and staff, and even the district for either meeting or not meeting students' needs. So as I mentioned, there's really this range that went in both directions. But I heard it most frequently around issues like socioeconomic status, disabilities, gender identity, sexual orientation. You'll see with respect to LGBTQ+, as well as race and ethnicity. I also heard a concern for students and demographics, which Pierce isn't currently reaching. There was a great questioning of the district's focus, where it's currently putting its attention. And the next area speaks to something that we heard earlier in terms of confusion over what diversity is. Not knowing what the definition is for diversity, and a desire for more clarification. Also, given how spread out the district is, we heard a lot of issues around the physical campus. And one of the other things was talk about communication. The last thing that I am going to be talking about are the visioning workshops. And initially, when I was posing this to the executive team, I was thinking that the visioning workshops are really going to help in talking about a future of what participants, employees, and students would like to see at Pierce around diversity and inclusion. But one of the things that I actually realized as I was having these conversations was that so much of them were based on what the current state of diversity and inclusion currently is. So as I mentioned earlier, we had 3 World Cafes which were held, and you'll see there are actually numbers of participants accompanying each of the locations, which we did at the end of January into in the beginning of February. We had a much greater number of employees who participated, which may have had something to do with the fact that we were able to hold our All District Day, a World Cafe around All District Day, and you'll see some photos of participants. And we used more or less the same set of questions. We did 3 different rounds using a method called the World Cafe, which you can find at theworldcafe.com online. And it's really a wonderful way of having large group discussion with very, very large numbers of people at the same time, having intimate discussion. So we asked a set of questions, and the way we facilitated this time was that folks were able to speak at small stations around these questions, taking notes. And then what we did was we asked folks to switch, mix it up, and go to new stations where they were able to bring some of the seeds of their last conversations, and then respond to new questions. So the first thing that we asked in round 1 was for people to imagine a college that exemplifies diversity and inclusion, a place fully inclusive of all students and employees. What would that district look like, smell like, feel? We asked folks to delve a little deeper in terms of policies, programs, campuses, classes, and curriculum. Then during round 2, we asked for actions they thought needed to be taken to achieve that type of an institution. And lastly, we talked about existing resources. I tend to be in favor of asset-based rather than deficit-based thinking, and by focusing on what we have, what would help to establish a foundation, that's how we attempted to try and build towards this inclusive district that we'd like to see. So, believe you me, there were large numbers of easel pad paper to review with lots of scrawl, and I'm very grateful to Pierce employees who helped capture all that information. So what I got from that was, again, in terms of takeaways, a desire for a definition around diversity, training around sensitivity, so that we won't be insensitive. Again, a desire for student clubs and programs, more communication and signage about current services, all of this pertaining to, again, diversity and inclusion. And then a desire to really integrate multiculturalism, the Common Core, into curriculum and assignments. We heard from employees, in particular, a desire for mentoring. Both students and employees talked about food options, how there's a desire for them to be more inclusive, to be a tool for helping reach equity, and again, looking at physical space, how it can be better utilized. Integrating art around campus to help express diversity. I also heard a lot of talk about partnerships, looking at external partnerships, ways to complement or enhance what's already going on in the district. Also heard about navigators, another way to help support students. And then once again, this desire for diverse talent recruitment. Looking at diverse talent, how we can get more of it at Pierce. Okay, so that is basically everything that I heard, and I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so going over what it was that I actually assessed and analyzed. So I broke all the information that I heard into 4 categories. And you'll actually hear, as I'm talking about some of the things that I found, there's a huge overlap between some of these categories, and some factors might be viewed as both a weakness and an opportunity. Some folks might see something as a strength, while others might see it as a threat. Threats tended to be things that were external, which Pierce didn't have as much control over, whereas the weaknesses, things which could have been done better, can also be viewed as ways which we can see about change. So just really quickly, in terms of strengths, these are some of these things you heard as I went through some of the takeaways. I'm not going to go through all of them right now. I think you can probably see them on the screen above you. But when we went to the weaknesses, I actually felt that some of those categories, I attempted to lump some of them together. So you'll see in the top left section of the weaknesses quadrant, things like lack of direction around diversity, things that have to do with diversity and inclusion infrastructure. Whereas on the upper right-hand corner of that weaknesses category, you'll see a desire for action, but at the same time, noticing that really has to be balanced with employee bandwidth. On the one hand, we can say things need to happen, but of course, when that takes place, you've got to make sure that something gets taken away. So there can be energy for that focus. I am also going to just point in the lower left-hand section of that weaknesses quadrant. You'll see things like student life programs, not that there aren't necessarily enough of them, but there tends to be a lack of knowledge about some of those resources. On top of that, you'll see some of the specific areas of diversity, disabilities, poverty, LGBTQ plus, where there were specific needs pointed out. And then I'm going to focus to opportunities in the lower left quadrant that you see. I have a number of recommendations or areas there that talk about building an equity, diversity, and inclusion infrastructure. One of the things, going back to the strengths, that was noted is that there's the administration's commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and now seemed opportune for taking advantage and really building on that, so there can be more recognition and leveraging of some of the things that are strong, the strengths around equity, diversity, and inclusion at Pierce. One of the other areas you'll see on the upper right hand of that opportunities quadrant are issues around diverse talent acquisition. Some other areas that were called out were things like looking at the complaint and grievance processes, and other ways to deal with some of the history that's taken place at Pierce. You will also see on the lower right hand area of the opportunities quadrant things like establishing an equity, diversity, and inclusion center, looking at diversifying campuses, and looking at diversifying the curriculum at Pierce. And then going to threats. There are a lot fewer things in that quadrant than there are, I think, in a lot of the other ones. Some things can't be overcome. The location is what it is. The campuses are placed where they are. But then we also deal with things like national trends with college preparedness. And then on the right-hand side of that quadrant, you see things like unwillingness to change. Some folks are where they are, but we want to make sure that we're actually dealing with those who can be changed or converted. So what you will see on the next slide was another one of my deliverables. After I put this SWOT analysis together, I also presented the executive team with an executive summary of that SWOT analysis, which were several worksheets, I think about 40 or 50 pages long. There was a lot of data in there, which is why I chose to condense it. But that information helped to inform this equity, diversity, and inclusion plan, and you will see here that what I focus on in that column on the left-hand side is really thinking about what is our goal around all of this. And with this working goal, we talk about improving Pierce's state capacity and capability around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and cultural competency to make it an even more relevant college. I have 4 objectives which I outlined. The first which is around building an equity, diversity, and inclusion infrastructure. Next, talking about this diverse talent acquisition and development. Thirdly, really looking at our campus culture. How do we, I hope you can still see me right now. How do we reinforce an environment inclusive of Pierce's diversity, both as a campus for students and as a workplace for employees? Even though we are a learning environment, we realize that we do 2 things here. And then lastly, looking at instructional educational support. We really are about the business of educating here, and we want to make sure that our core ability of multiculturalism is reflected in classes and through curriculum. So the next column, you'll actually see strategies that I outlined for each objective, and I'm going to go through these. I'm not going to go through all the tactics because we are running short on time, but hopefully you can read some of those above you. The first strategy, which goes back to this equity, diversity, and inclusion infrastructure, was about arming this individual who will be hired with tools for success. And I have outlined a number of tactics which will help to do that, including clarifying some of the definitions that folks were, I don't want to say conflicted around, but there were many different meanings. We want to make sure everyone's on the same page. And then also looking at our district planning, we know that equity is a value at Pierce, but we really want to make sure that all the district planning strategic plans actually refer to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that they are aligned. Both those plans are aligned so that all parties also feel some ownership. Again, on the one hand, we want to ensure that we have leadership around equity, diversity, inclusion. For that reason, we are putting together a job description and a work plan, but at the same time, it has to be work that everyone does. Diversity and inclusion are ways that we will achieve equity. So you'll see under the next objective around diverse talent acquisition and development, the strategy that I've identified is improving Pierce's numbers of employees of color, particularly on faculty and administrative levels. And then I have identified a number of tactics that can help us do that, from looking at best practices, helping our hiring committees achieve those best practices, piloting things like employee resource groups, and starting that with attendees from the Faculty and Staff of Color Conference, looking at mentoring programs, investigating double standards, things like that, towards particular employees. And next, I recommend, in terms of objectives, that we look at the campus culture. So again, this idea of looking at the campus as a place, both as a campus for students, but also as a workplace for employees. So thinking about, in terms of the strategies, how do we emphasize prioritization of equity, diversity, inclusion around campus, looking at a campaign for communicating this priority. Also looking at better utilization of some of the spaces on campus so that it can do that. Establishing this equity, diversity, and inclusion center. And then the next strategy has to do with streamlining delivery of equity, diversity, and inclusion related products. So we know that there are a number of products, be they trainings, programs, and services, which help us more effectively meet Pierce's, the community's changing needs. And although we know there are some really, really wonderful programs, I think we have the challenge that people on different campuses can go through one program, but someone on another campus doesn't have access to it. So that's one of the reasons why I called for looking at standardizing this and centralizing this. And then we are also looking at, all of a sudden, my eyesight. You're going to see my eyesight here. We talk about developing some systems for more effectively delivering services around diversity-related programs. So we know that we've got a wonderful staff who are doing a really good job of delivering these services. But one of the things that I heard a lot of is that oftentimes people don't know about services until the last moment in worst case scenarios. So we need to make sure that there's much more efficient delivery of those services as well as knowledge of them. And then one of the last things that I listed as a strategy is to strengthen community college connections. You have Pierce and you also have the surrounding community. So we want to make sure that we do outreach to some of the underrepresented student populations, as well as partner with existing community groups to try and enhance delivery of some of the services and programs that help to meet needs on campus, as well as increase the overall district's competency around equity and diversity and inclusion. Lastly, we're looking at the last objective, again, around instructional and educational support. One of the strategies that we have listed there is making sure that we support and provide tools for faculty to ensure inclusive learning. And the ways we can achieve this, again, are offering courses throughout the curriculum which are relevant to the student body, providing faculty with tools to be inclusive around not only content, but also looking at pedagogy, how we teach, and making classes accessible for all students. And when we talk about accessibility, we're not only speaking to issues of students with disabilities, but also looking at things like tracking. And then lastly, we want to provide students with curricular resources to navigate diversity. And we talk about doing this by integrating equity, diversity, and inclusion and cultural competence into college success, doing a better job of that. And then also exploring the completion of other diversity-related courses or programs for graduation. So that is our larger equity, diversity, and inclusion plan as it stands right now. I'm going to flip now to talking about this new position that we have discussed. And in front of you, you'll see a summary of it. It's something that Human Resources is working with the executive team right now to put out. But this position would serve on the executive team and report directly to, we're trying to figure out, would it be reporting directly to the chancellor? But this would be a key district leader charged with helping to establish the prioritization of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We know there's already a commitment to this in the district, and we want to make sure, again, that we're building this competency. And also ensuring simultaneously that capacity is built for some of the underrepresented groups on campus. So this person's position will be responsible for instituting the ED&I plan. As we mentioned, this goes hand in hand with the diversity plan. We got to make sure that an equity, diversity, and inclusion infrastructure is built. And then once that gets established, then there are these other areas that we also want to make sure are prioritized around diverse talent, looking at an inclusive campus workplace culture, and instructional educational support. I have also put together a work plan, and I am going to very quickly go through it in about 3 minutes so that we have 15 minutes for questions. But this is actually a shortened portion of the larger work plan, which was on legal size paper. I think what is most important in it is that the work plan really talks about actions, things that this new equity, diversity, and inclusion person will need to do. And then I've also attached desired outcomes and outputs. And the way I like to distinguish outcomes and outputs are what we ultimately want to have happen, and outputs are ways that will be achieved. But what's more important than the output is that the outcome takes place. So if you will go down, I'm not going through all of these, but if we look at, for example, if you look at number in the middle of the page, it's the second number 3. So one of the things that we're going to ask leaders to do is to review the SWOT analysis, some of the concerns that are listed in them with their supervisees, and develop goals for divisional and departmental work plans. And that's something that will help the equity, diversity, and inclusion be more embedded into the work of the district. And again, looking at the output, you'll actually see goals in divisional and departmental work plans from there. The next page, I'm going to point out one other thing that will hopefully make this distinction clearer for you. If we go down and look at the second number 3, which is the 1, 2, 3, 4, I believe it's the 5th column under the categories there of actions. It says review SWOT analysis concerns regarding an equity, diversity, inclusion center, develop budget, inventory, locations, determine location. So part of the reason to have an equity, diversity, inclusion center is to have an increased sense of safety, a greater sense of belonging, and also the feeling that Pierce has a real equity, diversity, and inclusion presence. We noted that a number of our peer institutions have that already. And looking at the outputs, okay, we're hoping for an equity, diversity, inclusion center at Pierce, but also looking at satellite locations on other campuses. So even though we may choose to have it at, say at Fort Steilacoom, we want to make sure at Puyallup and also at JBLM, they're additional places where access and information can be held, and for people to have that sense of safety. And I am lastly, this is the last page of the work plan. I am going to actually go to, to the first number 3, which is actually once again the 5th column down after actions, and actions 5th row down in the actions category. Review SWOT analysis concerns regarding access, accessibility, hold discussions, trainings about tracking students, consider policy changes regarding classrooms. So again, the outcome is that there's a greater diversity of students in classes, less tracking, and increased passing of classes, fewer drop classes. So that's really what we're trying to achieve. And I might even say, even on an even greater level, we're trying to make sure we have more students graduate. But the output associated with that would be different physical configuration of classrooms. And another output would be increased diversity of students in classes. So that actually brings us to the last part of the presentation, which is when I get to hear from you. Normally when I do workshops or sessions, I hate to have me speaking, because I know people tend to shut down. But now what I'm going to do is I'm actually taking my PowerPoint. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can just look at each other's lovely faces. And I'm hoping, Denise, that you are putting yourselves off mute and letting me know if people wrote down any questions. I can't hear anything.
We are
Okay, it looks like at I know you're off mute.
Okay, so the first question is one probably for Pierce College employees to answer, not Tanya, but it says, in building out this infrastructure, is this a new division being created? The scope seems too large for one person.
Do you want to take that, Denise?
So sure, I'll take it back out and Jennifer can chime in. As Tanya said earlier, this is the work of the college. This is the work of every single employee. And the thought around having a chief executive officer of diversity and inclusion is to help us coordinate all the threads that we have running through the college right now. So there will be an office, support, one of us just together, not one person, not. It's coordination of the efforts that are already underway and the direction for future ways to get us to go forward. So it is certainly not a division, but it's also not the work of a person. That's something we're really concerned about. Michelle? Want to chime in, or is that good? Oh, yeah. Okay, other questions?
Denise, this is Tanya.
Sure.
If I can just make one comment to that last question.
Please.
One thing that I often hear in the diversity world is that when everyone is in charge, no one's in charge. And that's one of the reasons why it was decided that we do actually need to have a leader around equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I think we sort of have to start thinking about EDI in the same way we think about things like fiscal responsibility. Although we may have someone in charge of finance and administration, it also has to be an ethic throughout the district in everyone's work.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm trying to figure out where the best place was to stand. Am I there? Hello there. Can you all hear me? All right, now we're talking. Hey, Denise, you may have to come back up and repeat what you said in the actual microphone. I think I heard about half of it. It was all scattered. So, yeah.
Okay, so what I said was that while there will be an office for an executive officer and support, this person is the person that will coordinate the work of the district, but all of us are responsible for that work. Just as Tanya just said, this is going to take the effort of everybody on all campuses at JBLM, but it will be the person that's in charge of the work in terms of helping us to coordinate that and set our vision and make sure that we're achieving that vision.
Excellent. All right, so we have two questions at Purella. the first one is, will the college have access to your presentation, Tanya?
I don't see why not. I know it's being recorded. I know this presentation is being recorded, and I am leaving it in the hands of President Yoakum and Chancellor Johnson to do what they would like with it.
Yes, it will be available. We will put the recording up on YouTube, and we will also put up the documents as well.
Okay, then the second question is about when can anyone or everyone read the entire plan that you put together?
I defer to President Yoakum.
I defer to Chancellor Johnson. So we will put the presentation up right away. We will probably not put the entire SWOT analysis out because there are some things in there that I think may or may not be appropriate for everyone to read, and we haven't waded through all of that yet, so we'll have to think about that. But we can put out certainly the diversity plan, the job description as we get it created. It's not created yet, and the rest of the information with all the survey results. But some of the comments we may not want to just widely distribute. We're still working on that. Some of the comments we may not widely distribute, and we're still working on that.
And President Yoakum?
Yes.
One thing I just might add is that the divisional leader will be able to work with all the supervisees, the direct supervisees, to determine what parts of the SWOT analysis are relevant to specific departments. So that's one way. That more employees will be able to see what was included.
Thank you.
At this time, there are no other questions from Puyallup.
We have another question here from Port Silicon, and the question is that in the presentation you talked about Christians and conservatives were feeling targeted. Can you speak about how you understood that?
How I understood that. Okay. A lot of the time, I have seen this reported in different academic institutions, in workplaces previously, that different religious groups or people of different affiliations feel like they are not able to speak their mind, or feeling like they are being targeted, or that they're the subject of different biases. And while I would say in the interviews, one of the things I had heard was that a number of individuals I spoke to felt that they were, they had felt that because they were maybe more liberal than what the surrounding community, how the surrounding community identified, they might not feel that they were able or comfortable speaking about their viewpoints. One of the things that I started hearing when I read the surveys, or I read some of the, or I listened to some of the focus groups, was that on the opposite side of the spectrum, those who were conservative or those who were religious felt like they were being told things like, "Oh, well, you're trying to shove your religion down people's throats," or "People of your political affiliation don't listen to other people." So that's what I heard.
Thank you. So there was a second part to that question: what do you think should happen with that? And I think that's part of the work that we'll all be doing as we move forward, is how do we respect everyone's views and differences. And I think that's part of the whole work that we're undertaking. So I'm not sure that Tanya can answer that, but I think that is work for the college community to do as we move forward and really create an environment of equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Is that? I wonder who that is. That looks like G. Gordon Liddy.
Other questions for Tanya?
Is his name on it?
Okay.
That's G. Gordon Liddy. All right.
Well, Tanya, I want to say on behalf of the college staff and the district, thank you so much for the work that you've done. Thank you for taking the time to come and have conversations with us, to survey us, interview us, and then to present us some really great recommendations that will help us move forward as a district as we work really hard to create a Pierce College where we're at 5 on that continuum and not at a 3. So that is work that we will look forward in the future, and that is really building towards student success and creating a culture where we can not only have higher level completions for our students, but to make sure that we are closing that equity gap as we do that, because we know that's what's most important to us at this point. So thank you so much for your time and effort. And Tanya's probably going to drop off. If you want to stay for a few more minutes, if you want any conversation with the off campus, we can do that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So are there any questions that you want to ask that you did not want to ask in front of the consultants, or that you want to ask now? Yes.
My question is probably larger, but we'll see if I can narrow it. I knew, so there's a information I'm not in, I hope to be able to read up on.
Put a speaker right next to the
Give me
computer.
some of this, you already all know, I just know. So this is in regards to us on this is in regard to the judgment 4, which is instructional education support. And just for those who may not know what my new bathroom student currently actually faculty and all. So a lot of my interest is in instructional and instructional inclusion is very important. And so my question is really about immigration. And I suppose I expect tell them we can't hear.
I will. I'm going to ask Denise to repeat it. Denise, you're going to have to repeat it because we can't hear a word.
It's okay, we don't have microphones out here, so if you could speak to them, the fellow folks would be able to hear you as well.
Okay, my name is Neva Cecilia Booth. I'm an adjunct faculty at Port Silicon, coming in as full-time faculty in the fall. And my question really is around sort of the instructional end of things. I understand there's been some disaggregated data that dates back to 2010. And I didn't know to what extent the work of the consultant looked into how to integrate the data collection and that part, and how that would be harnessed somehow through data analytics, for example, and how that would inform the development of tools that would then support instructors so that we can narrow the academic achievement gap as we move and achieve more, achieve at a higher level. And I guess I didn't know to what extent the scope of work actually looked at the integration of that work, the disaggregation of data, and the work of inclusion and equity, and with the overall goal for the college to meet the goals of students to be ready to be economic agents in the world and have certain skills and all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, Nina. Thank you. Did you all get that? So I think I can take a crack at that, and then Marty can chime in as well, or Deb. But I think that, and we have some of our deans in the room right here, but currently that is purview of the vice presidents and the deans of instruction and learning and student success. The work that they're currently doing, our department has the data all ready. It can be looked at, as we talked about a little bit earlier. It can be looked at by course, faculty, it can be looked at by subject, course completion. We have a center working on strategies around cultural competency and working on developing the track for faculty to take to go through that, and also looking at best practices. So I think this will be a resource for us as we do that work, but that work is going to work at the faculty, and the deans and the vice presidents. So, and that work's already taken a lot of faculty and staff are already doing that work, but it's work that we as we go forward. Oh, sorry. I forget. Sorry, y'all. Sorry. Any other questions?
Yeah.
We have a question.
Okay.
Okay. Can you guys hear me over there?
Yes.
Okay. So, hi, my name is Morgan Pasquire. I'm a student here, as well as the sustainability coordinator on the Student Leadership Activity Board.
No problem.
My question is that this seems like a really big project to take on. Like, there's a lot of different aspects to it, and I was wondering, is there a certain set timeline for this? Like, when are we going to actually start seeing things changing and happening on our campuses in response to this research?
Wow. That's a big question.
Great question.
Holly, you're welcome to jump in at any point, but I was going to say things have been changing all along. This isn't, we're starting from ground zero here. I got you. Ready? We've been doing things all along. I'll just give you one example where we've already done a major change is when we go out and our position announcements. We used to have minimum qualifications and preferred qualifications, and we're getting rid of the preferred qualifications because we've noticed that knocks out a lot of diversity. If the preferred was something like 6 years of community college teaching and a PhD, then you already knocked out all these people who just came out of the university with a master's degree and no community college teaching, but a lot of passion and a lot of commitment, and they're ready to go. They just need their first position.
I don't know all the inner workings of administration and stuff like that. All I really know is what I see from my positions in life and then from PhD going around campus, take part in campus.
So one of the things that I would first say is that this is not a project. Can you hear me? And where's the look up?
Yeah.
So this is not a project. This is a cultural change. And how long is it going to take from now until we exist? Because really what we're doing every day is identifying who we are, how we work, what we're about, recognizing the strengths and differences that we have, the areas where we don't have the resources in place for everybody to be successful. We know we have limited resources, so that we have to be really strategic in the ways in which we engage them. And it's already been said that the individual who will assist in leading this is only going to be, not only, a big part will be the convener. And again, if each of us don't take this fully committing ourselves to it, then we'll come up short. And so each of us examining ourselves of who we are, what we're about, what we think, what we need to do, and how we do that in a way that embraces really the mission of Pierce College. Again, to create these quality educational opportunities for the diverse community of learners to thrive in evolving world. It's about thriving. It's about how all of us do that. How we do it as employees, because that transfers into students. Students feel that. We feel with one another. And how do we learn from students? So the role of student life is to help us learn from you. And we heard a lot of the consultant talking about clubs and activities and events, and that's a key role that student life, will see. We know that there's this recommendation about a center for equity and inclusion. We have spatial challenges here. So the question is how do we use the space we have that makes sure that it's inviting and inclusive for all folks? And what are the messages and signals that we're sending that may not be the signals that we want to send? And so that's what's going to happen in all of this. It's just an ongoing opportunity for all of us to learn and to grow.
Shut up, Michelle.
Embrace who we are.
And the position description is almost complete. We'll be posting that as soon as possible for the executive officer position. It's not going to be a VP position. It'll be an executive officer. It will sit on the executive team, and it will report to the chancellor.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anyone else?